Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. It is 1 year of the war in Ukraine that continues without a resolution in sight. We take a look at what have been the costs of this war that continues to pull the world into its orbit, causing a massive crisis beyond the battleground. And going from the battleground to the playground, we talk about the war's impact on the world of sports in the past year. And finally, in this episode, we also take a look at Fiji, where leaders from the Pacific Islands gather at a time of rising tensions among superpowers in the region. The war in Ukraine has been going on for 1 year. It has not only cost thousands of human lives in Ukraine, but also affected economies around the globe. The conflict is continuously threatened by escalation, and we are now joined by Abdul from People's Dispatch, who has been following this issue closely with us. Welcome to this episode, Abdul. It has been 1 year of the war in Ukraine, and yesterday in the UN General Assembly, a resolution was passed that asked Russia to withdraw. So, can you, for starters, take us through the broad highlights of the events that have happened and the developments that have happened in the last year?
Well, the resolution, of course, was passed asking Russia to withdraw from all the Ukrainian territories. But this is again a General Assembly resolution. There has been resolutions in the past as well, asking for the similar thing, end of the war and so on and so forth. But everyone knows, whoever is involved in the process of making such resolutions and kind of making it pass in the General Assembly or in other forums, knows that Russia will not cease fire or the war will not end at this moment until the conditions put forward by Russia are addressed in some way or another. The NATO expansion was one of the major issues which basically was used as justification for Russia's attack in Ukraine, if we remember in last year. In fact, instead of acting on it, NATO has expanded. 2 more members have applied for its membership. As far as the weapons deployment around Russia's borders are concerned, it is a well-known fact that the US and other NATO powers have been supplying billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine and other neighboring countries, and kind of building up an anti-Russia momentum in the region. Ukraine has not responded to Russia's demands of autonomy or the implementation of the Minsk agreement, which was one of the reasons, immediate reasons, because of which Russia started its quote-unquote special military operation.
Right.
Until all these issues are addressed, there is no reason for Russia to kind of cease fire, as I said before, and therefore resolutions can be passed one after the other. It will not have much impact. Russia has also kind of expressed in the last 1 year that how the war in Ukraine has been used by the NATO and the Western forces, namely US and European Union, to basically act on their anti-Russia agenda. So numerous sanctions imposed on Russia in last 1 year. The kind of sabotage, the blasts of the Nord Stream gas pipelines carried forward allegedly by the US as per the different reports. All of these basically indicate that there is a growing realization among Russians in particular that the war in Ukraine is no more limited to Ukraine, and it has become a proxy war between Russia and the West. Therefore, the possibilities of kind of such resolution having an impact on the large course of the war is minimum at this time. One should also remember that the Russian claims while in the beginning of the war in Ukraine were basically related to the larger geopolitical agenda, larger geopolitical status, and also about the rights of the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. And all the resolutions, UN resolutions, have refrained from speaking about all these issues. Hence, I think these resolutions will remain on paper and will have no impact on the ground.
Right, Abdul. And you mentioned resolution while you were answering the previous questions. Let's talk a little bit about that. What do you think are the prospects of a peace settlement or any kind of resolution coming forth in near future when we talk about the war?
Well, that is very interesting point. If you see, in the beginning of the war last year, there were talks between Russia and Ukraine, first in Belarus, then in Turkey. Those talks ended without any explanation. Later on, by the way, the media reports indicated that it has to do something, the stoppage of the talks has something to do with the pressure exerted by the UK and other Western countries who did not want Ukraine to kind of have a negotiated settlement with Russia. And Boris Yeltsin visited Kyiv and basically offered more help in return that Ukraine withdraws from the talk, and that is what reported in the media, in the local media, and later on in international global media as well. So if you see, since then, since April last year, there has been no formal negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Whenever Ukrainian president has spoken in public about the possibilities of talk, he has put stringent conditions, like Russia had to withdraw completely, has to agree to kind of war remuneration, and to face trial related to human rights violations, war crimes, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Until all these conditions are met, there will be no talk. These are impossible conditions, and there can be no talk. That's why these particular conditions are put. That's the politics behind it, it seems. If you notice, the attempts to kind of push both the countries for political dialogue has been minimal in last 1 year. The only proposal which has come so far are two. The only proposals which have come are basically two. One, of course, proposed by Zelensky during his visit to United States, which basically, again, as I said before, puts impossible conditions, and Russia has rejected it. Chinese have come forward and basically proposed a 12-point agenda, which can be a basis for negotiations. But as I said before, it seems that the West is not willing to have any kind of dialogue at this moment, to allow any kind of dialogue at this moment between Ukraine and Russia, while pushing Ukrainians for continue the war, for the basic reason that this kind of provides them an opportunity to pursue, it seems, their anti-Russia agenda.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us, Abdul. We'll keep following the updates from Russia and Ukraine with you. The domains of sports and politics are poles apart as the world generally thinks. We now carry on our discussion about the war in Ukraine into the world of sports. The International Olympic Committee, the body that commands a large part of global sport, has released a statement on the 1-year anniversary of the war. To talk more on this issue, we're joined by Siddhant Annie. Thank you for joining us, Siddhant, on this very important episode where we're marking the 1 year of the war in Ukraine. So, coming to the world of sports, the IOC has released this statement about the war in Ukraine. Can you first off tell us about what this statement is and what does it highlight, and take it from there on?
Yeah, thanks, Shreya, for having me. So, it's an interesting statement. It comes as the follow-up to several statements that the International Olympic Committee has made over the course of this 1 year, including, as it says in the opening line, on the day that the war actually broke out. And they have consistently condemned, of course, war. But where they have gone a step further, I think, in this statement, in connection with the bans that are already in place, as we know, on athletes from both Russia as well as Belarus, in terms of international competitions across the board. The International Olympic Committee effectively controls the vast majority of global sporting events that happen wherever they happen in some form or the other. And when I say control, I mean maybe they are not directly responsible, but the organizations that host these events somehow lead up to and are part of the what is known as the Olympic family. They have marked the governments of Russia and Belarus as the sole aggressors in this conflict, and I think in doing so very clearly taken a political stance on where this conflict stands and where the IOC stands in regard to the conflict. So while the message is one of peace and it ends with I suppose the now oft repeated words and famous quote, "Give peace a chance," which is a very great idea, and the IOC has expressed its willingness or its availability to contribute in its own way to building that peace. But while saying that, when you pick a side in the conflict, your position inherently and automatically becomes political. So the part of the statement that somehow is conflicting is where they talk about something being the realm of politics and sport can only do that much. Of course, this is true. But in keeping with their own members and the varied opinions that they have, whether it's the governments or the national Olympic associations of the member nations, right? For example, we've talked before on this show of how the Olympic Council of Asia has invited Russian and Belarusian athletes to participate in the Asian Games.
Right.
Yeah. So it means the whole world or all 206 member nations of the International Olympic Committee are not aligned in assigning saying who is the aggressor and who is not and what the details of this conflict may or may not be. They are saying that this is not a conflict that involves us, and therefore, like everyone else, we would want to give peace a chance because that is actually in the best interest of everyone around the world, not just athletes from Ukraine or Belarus or Russia. So in that context, this statement tries to balance the very Western makeup of some of the leadership of the International Olympic Committee with the political stance that many of its member states have taken. Because they are likely to face some kind of fallout if they go any further. And as we also discussed on this show before, when the executive board of the IOC met, they had discussions and agreement on finding a way to allow athletes from both Belarus and Russia to participate as individuals in the upcoming Paris Olympics and Milan Cortina Winter Olympics, which happened 2 years after that in 2026. Rightly, as they pointed out, we see no end with no side really suing for peace. We see no end to this conflict in the near future. And so they are looking ahead to 2026 as well and finding a way to include these athletes while banning explicitly the national anthems, the flags, and any other symbols of the country that they represent.
Right.
So that's essentially what the statement reiterates.
Right, Siddhant. And there's something also about conflict that the statement says, and that's that despite conflict, sports is sometimes able to bring these, competing countries together in a playground. So, but it mentions conflicts like Israel and Palestine also. What would you say about that?
Without sort of trying to take too much time, it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. On the one hand, okay, if you take a stance throughout that the smaller nation, right, is the nation that you will support in a situation like Russia and Ukraine, then that needs to be sort of consistent across the board. In the context of Israel and Palestine, that becomes an extremely challenging idea to accept on the part of the international Olympic movement as such, not just what the committee might say, but also in terms of participation at various games and events and things like that. It would be extremely naive to assume that Palestinian athletes have the same kind of access to these sporting events that athletes from Israel do, for example, or that by any means today the state of Palestine and the state of Israel are comparable. There is definitely one aggressor, one oppressor in that relationship. And so therefore to equate that to what is happening in Europe at the moment is, like I said, it's apples and oranges. And I don't think there's any benefit in comparing also these various conflicts. Each requires its own resolution. And its own kind of dialogue. So if they had to take a stance, it should have been a balanced one. It should have been as apolitical as they might have wanted to be, in that saying we support athletes of all these three nations who are involved in this conflict equally, in equal measure, which means that the solidarity fund that has been created, for example, will be shared equally, right? You could also argue that athletes who have been banned from competition are suffering more than athletes who are allowed to participate in it.
Right, yeah.
Right? Of course, no one is saying that the situation in Ukraine is not dire. It is, no doubt. But the governments of those two countries have to work towards coming to a peaceful resolution to what has become a prolonged conflict. That's not up to the athletes or the Olympic Association of that country. And so in that regard, they've kind of muddied or muddled things up, conflated all kinds of different ideas to give us a set of words that are supposed to be, not saying a lot, but not saying anything at all. And this very much reflects, I think, in our earlier conversations on the show on wider military, economic, political issues also, the kind of confusion that exists in the West about now that they are in the conflict and on one side of the conflict, how to actually come to any resolution. And the stance that world sporting bodies, particularly those that are largely governed by Western individuals or organizations, reflect that utter confusion at this point.
Right. Thank you so much, Siddhant, for joining us. Leaders from Pacific Island nations gathered in Fiji on Thursday, February 23rd. The event takes place at a time of heightened competition between China and US in the Pacific region. The two countries have recently appointed special envoys for the region, while Micronesian leaders earlier this month flagged a likely visit to the region by US President Joe Biden. Anish from People's Dispatch joins us with more updates on this issue. Welcome to this episode, Anish. Thank you for joining us. So, first off, can you take us through the key points of discussion in this meeting?
Well, I think at the center was Kiribati's return to the Pacific Islands Forum. Kiribati was the country that left over the dispute over the election of the General Secretary in 2021. So it was one of those Micronesian countries that actually left the forum, and it was one of those that actually successfully finished off the process of leaving the forum entirely. Now its return marks the sort of completing the whole Pacific Islands Forum membership, because pretty much all the sovereign nations would be in it back again. On the other hand, the rotation of the Secretary General's position was also at the heart of the discussions, and we will have the rotation happening between the three regions of Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. And the Micronesian representative this year would be from Nauru, and it will be Baron Waka. From the reports that we are seeing right now, Baron Waka is somebody who is very strongly anti-China, as we know. But nevertheless, it is a big win for the Micronesian countries who have always had this, have always got the short end of the deal in the forum and the manner in which it functions. So apart from that, on the more strategic and international relations wise matters, the most significant thing that we saw being discussed was the Fukushima nuclear wastewater being dumped in the ocean. That was at the heart of the discussion. That was something that concerned everybody in the forum. And while Japan, and we have spoken about this before in this show, but Japan continues to insist that it is safe to release these waters, but it's complete opaqueness of the process. There's absolutely no transparency on how much water it will be releasing, for how long, and the timeline, the entire timeline and process with which it will be releasing this whole thing. And this is something that Pacific Islands nations have, the smaller ones at least, have very vociferously opposed in different international forums, including the IAEA. So these were some of the matters, and this was one of those big, international relations matter. They want Japan to be more responsible and also to be more forthcoming about their entire process. And obviously, they're not saying there is no like unilateral opposition to releasing the waters. but there is hesitance or this fear of or wariness that the island nations have about the impact it will have environmentally to them.
Thank you so much for joining us, Anish. And that's all for today's episode. For more such stories, keep following peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.